what we're talking about today is how architecture and urban design affects us all in ways that we might not think about and might not even seem that clear or obvious, but actually can be quite profound. And very much on that theme, I'll start up with this pretty famous quote from Winston Churchill. And while architecture doesn't dictate behavior directly, architecture and urban planning does kind of create the sandbox that we play in. It defines the boundaries and in many ways the options that are available to us. It has the power to suggest and even direct human activity in pretty powerful ways. And this quote reminds us that our built environment is not something that's static, but it's part of an ongoing relationship that has quite a lot of back and forth. Just around a century ago, there was this enthusiasm among a group of architects for really making these grand schemes for how cities can change. At the time, in this, the Industrial Revolution had just completely changed cities. And there was a lot of problems. And while we look at that now and might go, ugh, there's a lot of problems with that too, the intention was to shape our cities in a way that improved those problems. And so a lot of the time, really influenced by a desire to create more egalitarian and more democratic spaces. That's not what we see today, because we've actually seen how some of these schemes, while none of them were built exactly as they were proposed, they weren't intended to. They were actually intended to influence all of the small decisions, to realize how those small decisions add up to vast change over time. And they did exactly that. A lot of our cities actually are really quite directly descended from some of these grand utopic visions, and in ways that didn't work out quite as well as we had hoped. This scheme in particular, and a lot of Le Corbusier's ideas, he was one of the, probably, arguably the most influential 20th century architect. But that influence wasn't always positive, because a lot of the copycats and ideas ended up actually turning into bad things. You can see housing projects coming directly out of this in this sort of theoretical line. And of course, the housing projects across the states, and we have some examples here in Canada, are not exactly nice places. Another very influential scheme is this one. This is where Suburbs came from. And I don't need to talk too much about it, other than that to go with this theme of trying to influence the way people live through the way that we design our buildings and cities. And there's kind of an extreme example that I thought was worth bringing to your attention, and it was actually mentioned in the poster about this talk. This is a TED Talk from a Syrian architect that I would encourage you all to go see. As with all TED Talks, it's nice and short. It's only about 10 minutes long. And she talks about how the conflict in Syria, she interprets as having roots in architecture and urban planning. And historically, Syria and her home city of Homs was a very diverse place. And lots of people from all kinds of different cultures, different religions got along really well. And it was a crossroads, it was a trading post, and a very diverse place. But when the French colonials come in, they decided, oh, this is antiquated, we need to do something modern, we need to improve it. And what happened was they zoned urban spaces by creed or by affluence or by place of ancestry, and the shape of the city changed over time. And communities started to drift apart, and society started to get ghettoized. And conflict became progressively more and more easy when people were segregated into these pre-categorized communities, and you saw everyone else as that's where the other people live. And Marwa al-Sabourni also noted that major Western cities are starting to look much the same. Paris was one of the examples she mentioned in particular, and it's a little bit foreboding. And of course, what the French colonials did was about 100 years ago. So when you're thinking about architecture and urbanism, you really are thinking on longer timescales. But there's also really positive examples of how cities change over time. This is Amsterdam. And just over the course of a couple of decades, that city transformed completely. A few short decades ago, Amsterdam made the choice to prioritize people on foot and people on bike and people on transit. And made sure that their streets and public spaces were emphasizing that order of priority, and people in private vehicles were way down the list. And that wasn't always the case, as these pictures show. And when we're having conversations here in Victoria about things like the bike lanes, and all over cities, a common excuse is, well, we're not Amsterdam. We can't do anything, we're not Amsterdam. Neither was Amsterdam. It was a conscious decision. And I think that's the point I really want to hammer home here, is that our cities are shaped by decisions that people make. And it's not some abstract force, it's not the only way that things could possibly be. It's decisions by people. And it's decisions by people who, in a lot of ways, were influenced by these modernist utopian visions that I started out talking about, or influenced by some academic theory, or influenced by some economic theory. Personally, I think that's a problem. I think it should be influenced by the people who live there. And Amsterdam took that route. People said, we want a place where we can walk, we can bike, and they got it. And I think that's a really important lesson. We're here on Earth Day talking about all kinds of things throughout the day, including ways that we can make change. And I think that one of the really important things that we all need to recognize is that when we find it difficult to take the bus or take the bike or do anything but get in our car to get around, it's not because we're bad people. We don't need to feel guilty about that. What we need to do is recognize that we've designed our cities to make that the easiest choice. It's not a moral failing, it's a failing of design. And so let's rethink design when we find the good choices the harder ones to make, and the better choices really inconvenient. So an example a little bit closer to home is the City Repair Project in Portland, Oregon. And the transformation in Portland is not yet as profound as it was in Amsterdam, but it might one day get there. And it started with a group of neighbors who, without the city's permission, took over an intersection and turned it into a public space for people to gather, rather than a space for cars to pass through. And neighbors got to know each other, and it really changed the community life for the people around. But of course, eventually, since they did it without permission, and people wanted to do it in their neighborhoods too, it did have to go before City Council. And when they made their presentation asking for permission to do it over and over again, they pointed out that America has the lowest number of public spaces per capita in any first world nation. And it also has the highest incidence of violence. And they argued that the two are actually related, much like Marwa al-Sawari did in Syria. And when you don't have space to meet your neighbors, you can't have community. And that's a problem. And when people out there are marked as others, differentiated spatially, physically, in a lot of ways that seems to be related to conflict. So the City Repair Project, that name is really quite serious. They want to repair the cities because cities are broken. We don't have places to get to know our neighbors. We don't have the physical infrastructure to encourage the right choices and for the environment, or the right choices for our neighbors and our community. So in Victoria, how do we want to see our city change as we grow? And this is a rendering of Douglas Street. You might not recognize it from the air, but there's the CIBC tower right here. And this was a scheme presented about 2 years ago, prepared by some fellow architects in town, a firm called Cascadia Architects. And they think this is possible in about 20 years. And I think it's only going to be possible if we all get behind changes like this. And if we insist that I want to make the right choice for the environment and the right choice for a community also the easiest choice and supported by the way that we build our cities. So on that note, I've been talking about sort of larger scale urbanism, and my partner Will is going to take it to the building scale.
So, I love this image. There's so much you can do, and as Graham says, it's about designing our world so that the best choice is the easiest. It's the most opportune. It's right there in front of us. And what I wanted to start with is this photograph. This is a photograph of the protests for Standing Rock. And as many of you probably read in the news, this was a big protest that went on and on and on opposed to the pipeline and oil. Now, a lot of the skeptics would look at this and say, gee, you know, those protesters have a lot of cars. How can they protest oil without being hypocritical when they have to drive there in their one-ton Chevy? That's a good point. And it's a point that a lot of critics would bring up again and again and again to say that you can't protest oil because you need it. You can't protest any of these things because you'll be hypocritical if you do. Now back to Graham's point is that, well, why don't we redesign so that there's the opportunity so that protesters or anyone with an idea about this isn't forced to go a direction that they don't want to take. So we look, okay, well, you know, there's the electric cars. Electric cars are a great step. It's in the right direction. But of course, they still need all this infrastructure. As Graham pointed out, all of this infrastructure, of course, is built by asphalt and mining and so on, which uses a whole lot of bitumen, which of course is really not where we want to get at all. So even if we go back to this car, we're still not there. And that means we have to rethink more than just what fuel source we're using. So the debate about oil and the debate about how cars are fueled is only just part of the picture. It's the easiest part to see, but it's not the whole thing. So again, when we talk about what we can do with our streets, this is a picture of a street. It used to be full of cars. Now, of course, we can turn it into parkways, walkways, pedestrian ways. If you think about what the streets could be if the cars were the minority, again, this is not hard to do. It just takes design. It takes forward thinking to look at this and say, well, you know, it's not like we have to say cars are evil. Cars are just not the best answer. Let's make it not illegal or we're not opposed to all of this entirely, but we want the best answer to be easier. So in this case here, you can see far more people will choose to ride their bikes or to walk because it's easier, it's more convenient, and it works better. This is a function of design, carefully thought out by all of the people who live there and the planners who make this happen. This is another one that I want to show. This is, look at these guys. So back in the day, we all used to just put our trash into the trash bins. This is just how it all was. All the cities were like this. We decided that this is too much. We needed to design recycling stations. And so now we do. We have them. They're easy. They're convenient. We've made this a much easier choice so that when you show up with a little bit of garbage or waste, you have the option now. That's, again, by design. So we used to be in this situation. Now we have more choices. This is part of what we can do. Now, we can look at our waste. This is in the Guggenheim Museum. This is a real functioning toilet out of solid gold. We can design our toilets to be anything we want, but we don't really control what happens after it's out of our hands. And so, regardless of how we make this toilet, regardless of how enthusiastic we are about making the world a better place, we don't control what happens to the end of the pipe. And again, this is a design decision. This is a decision that comes to the way we plan our cities, the way we plan our infrastructure. And again, regardless of how we want to work, we can't change this because it's been designed for us. And so even though I don't want my waste to be coming out the end of this pipe, I have little control. And even with my gilded toilet, I can't control the outcome. I wanted to show this picture here because it's a picture of houses. This is in China. You can see the state of the houses. They're a bit rudimentary. And you can see the power plants behind them. The power plants which are necessary in order to make the living quality for these people bearable. And so we can't simply fault people for turning their heat on. We need it. This is part of what we need to have. The way that we get this currently creates this massive problem. And so we need to design the problems and the solutions and design the way that we work in order to mitigate that. So we look at our own little house right here. We all love those old houses and the old windows. The windows are beautiful and they're cold. Now we've come a long way with our windows. Here's a great way of, I'm sure everybody's lived in a house like this sometime in their youth. That's certainly one way to deal with it. The way they used to deal with it is with great big fireplaces. You would just make more heat, burn more wood, and that would solve the problem of how to heat those houses. Now these days we don't have fireplaces like that, we have oil furnaces. In fact, even oil furnaces are becoming outdated. As many of you know, we don't have to have oil furnaces, there's many better ways. Even in the hot summer though, we still have problems. And you can see all of these buildings with all of these air conditionings. These are things that we can't fault people for having them, for needing them. This is part of the way that we need to live. We need to live comfortably. We need to get our work done. We need to, live in our buildings. But all of that drives this. Now, this is a coal-fired power plant, and that's certainly part of what we need to do, or perhaps get away from. But the idea that we need the power is absolutely essential. We can get power by creating dams. This is a picture of Site C Dam under construction. These are relatively current photographs. This is kind of the state of where things are right now because we need to power our air conditioners and our heaters. This is part of what we need to do. I mean, there's other ways to do it as well. We don't have to build a dam, but that doesn't change the fact that there's a draw on energy that we need to address. However we want to solve this problem, the design of our buildings is what's creating this problem. So we can tackle it in many different ways, but we haven't actually addressed the root of the problem. Control and how we live in our spaces, how our spaces are designed, is the root of the problem. And that's our argument here, is that we can look at the way the spaces we live in and the spaces we work in, the architecture that we have, as being the real reason that we have to have a Site C dam, or not. The real reason that we have to increase our electrical production, or not. We look at the way the houses are built. This is a multiplex, very common. There's nothing unique about this project in particular. But we can change the way that they're designed. I wanted to show this picture here because the difference between these two buildings is profound. And yet really, there's only subtle differences in the way that the projects are built. The one on the left will show a typical building which has a massive thermal bridge, which means that we have to require far more energy to make it work. This is the way buildings are currently built. The one on the right is a passive house window, which means that you can basically heat an entire house with the energy that you get from a hairdryer. You can imagine that if we lived in buildings like this, we wouldn't need Site C Dam. We wouldn't need a wind farm. We already produce enough energy to supply all that we need. So the way that we build this building changes what we need from our infrastructure and the way that we need to design that. Now this is one I put in for my daughter. She was looking at this and thinking, this is great. Okay, let's look at the buildings, let's look at our houses. So here's a house. What does it need? Well, she says it needs all kinds of things. It needs to have a carpet, it needs to have a shelf, we need to put a sofa in it, we need all kinds of stuff. So we go to the furniture warehouse. where we can buy lots of stuff to put into that empty box. Eventually that stuff's going to wear out though. It's not going to last too long. And so that stuff ends up here. This is not news. I'm sure you guys all recognize the root of all of the consumption that we have. Now, it's not to say that everything is unused. It gets used eventually by something somehow. But in contrast, I'm going to go back a bit, in contrast to this room, which is what we currently design for us to live in. This is the houses that we seek. These are the houses that we ask for. These are the types of buildings that we ask all those developers to make for us. They don't make it to decide for us. They do it for demand. This is what we're asking for. This is what we're getting. It's not the only way. It's just a common way. I'm going to skip ahead now, past our friendly bear, to a house that does not require that sofa. In fact, you couldn't fit that sofa in this house. People can live here just as easily. It's a different way to design a home. This is a good example of a tiny house. Now, tiny homes are becoming more popular now too, and they may not be the right answer for everybody. This is an answer. This is a solution to this. My point is that this is designed specifically to avoid the requirements for large sofas in furniture warehouses. If we design this room, we get very different results than if we design this room. These are the ways that we build around our cities and the ways that we create spaces for ourselves that affect far more than what we'd like to be complicit with. And so while I don't want my sofa to end up in the landfill and occupied by a bear, if I build houses and if I build rooms and I design my habitation in such a way that requires them, I'm going to do it. I know that there's warehouses full of furniture out there selling to people like me who have rooms like this that need to be filled with stuff. We don't have to go very far in our city to realize that this is actually a very small room. There are houses with rooms 10 times this size that need to get filled with 10 times as much stuff. All of that stuff creates this problem. This problem is not something we want to be complicit with, but the way that we've designed our homes, the way that we've designed our societies, the way that we've designed all of that affects the marketing, it affects the production, and eventually this is the result. This is a design solution to help mitigate that. Now, this might not be, like I say, the answer for everybody, but this, I think, is a very good example of how architecture and the design of our habitation can drastically affect the world that we're living in, everything from the power consumption to consumption in general. And that's where I want to stop here. I think now when I have a bit of questions.
Thanks. So to head into what we hope will be a really engaging back and forth conversation, I just wanted to preface it with the fact that what we've been talking about, of course, is choices that designers make. And one of the things that our firm deeply believes in is the democratizing of that design process. So we've seen how lots of mistakes have been made over history, and how decisions that designers make have limited the options available to us. What we would love is to hear how you would like Victoria to look like, how you would like your homes to look like, how you would like your offices, your schools to look like. And with the understanding that it's entirely up to us if we want it to be.
So, when we look at the city, as Graham had pointed out, we can see that vision of what Douglas Street corridor could be. That's one way to look at this. Again, with micro homes, that's the way that our homes could be. But I want to hear from you when we think about the design that affects your lives, decisions that you find are hard to make that could be made easier. For instance, televisions, recycling of materials, life cycle costs of all of the things that we need, the effects of our smartphones on people in India, or that dump in China. These are all things decisions that we make that affect the planet as a whole. And of course, we don't want to create a dump in China.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, when you're talking about trying to improve car infrastructure, the net result is you end up with pointless speed between pointless speed between bottlenecks, and that's the lesson that we've learned over the past 100 years, and we're still going down that route, and I'm equally frustrated with it. And one of the other things is we have a rail line out to the Western communities that's already there that we're not using. You know, I find it mind-boggling that we're sinking such vast amounts of money into car infrastructure that is really not serving us.
I think coming back to the theme of this presentation too is that we have the opportunity to make a design choice. So we can design the easy answer to be to drive, because driving will be easier with these interchanges made. We won't have these bottlenecks, hopefully. Driving is supposed to be made easier, and that's the design intent. So the intention here is to make cars an easier answer for transportation. We're spending, as you say, hundreds of millions of dollars to make that happen. People don't take the bus because it's inconvenient. There's more reasons than that. But if taking a bus was far easier to get downtown than to get in your car, you'd realize people would take buses all the time. But that's not the way that we've designed it. Well, I think that's touching on I guess the misunderstanding of value, or the misallocating of value. So when we understand cost, we can look at the cost of the house in the suburbs or the cost of the house downtown. There's lots of costs that we can all follow through and we can understand. And when you talk about living in an economy, very much many of our decisions are based on costs. Value is a harder thing to establish, and this comes in many ways to what we value as a people. And I would argue that even though you may be quite right that we're living in an economy rather than in a culture, we value culture. We just can't monetize it in the same way to say that it's worth this and not that.
I'd maybe add a couple of layers to that. So there's price, and there's cost, and there's value, right? Price, easy to measure, right? And that's what economists tend to do most of the time. And it's frustrating, and it's gotten us into all kinds of problems. Cost, we can take a run at trying to evaluate that. There's you can put a cost to lost ecosystem services. You can put a cost to putting in infrastructure that you are going to have to maintain and repair for the next 100 years versus infrastructure that is lower maintenance. And so trickier to measure, but you still can. And then value is you get into what we should care about. And this is going back to the idea of democratizing the design process, right? When you talk about, or when you look at who's making which decisions, and the decisions to put in the Mackenzie interchange, or the decision to, all of the little decisions that add up to the cities that we have now, going back to those sort of utopian visions of what this new industrial technology can do for us, what can all of these wonderful new things do? It's all with good intentions, those terrible tower blocks were intended to be good. They wanted people to have fresh air. They wanted people to have good quality buildings. And
they're the French international slums.
Yeah, and I think that it goes exactly to your point of when we're measuring the wrong thing, we make the wrong decisions. And I think if I can kind of summarize what you're saying, that seems to be how I'm interpreting it anyway. Mm-hmm. So we need to change what we're measuring and be okay with qualitative measurements instead of quantitative measurements.
One of the points that brings up is that we can demonize a developer, some anonymous developer, for buying up a city lot and destroying a playground of its place. There's one reason that happens, and that's because there's more profits to be made by doing that. Now, the profits, again, this isn't some villainous anti-thing. It's us. We're the ones that make the demand for those things. We can either demand those houses or demand a different kind of housing. The other things that come out of that is that we can look at the way that the city allocates lots within our city to say that, okay, well, this zone or this block is zoned for a high-rise multi-unit residential building. Or it could be zoned for a park with lots and lots and lots of microhomes. Or it could be designed for 6 families with a backyard. Or it could be zoned for an industrial waste dump. There's lots of things that we can decide as a city to do that. Inevitably, what's going to happen, though, is that the people like us are going to ask for a house. We can't afford this house somewhere in this idyllic place, so we're going to ask for something that's more affordable, which turns out to be the bottom line, which turns into a profit that gets turned into one of these buildings that we now look at saying, well, gee, we don't really like that, but we're the reason that it's there.
I do want to qualify that a little bit, though. There was a bit of investigative journalism done by a reporter who works for the Tyee recently, and came up with some kind of disturbing statistics and points of view from the developers working, especially around some of the in all of the really hotspot markets, like San Francisco, Toronto, Vancouver would be the Canadian examples, but yeah, and you go to the States, and all of the places where if you're making less than $250,000 a year, you can't find housing. And it's so yes, and I think Victoria, we're not immune from this. We might get there one day. But developers' incentive is to serve the people who can pay ridiculous amounts of money. And so I want to take a step back from purely talking about the form of our buildings and talk about the form of our economy, where if you have more dollars, you have more say. And that's what the market does. And that's a big reason why Vancouver is a completely impossible place to find a house if you have even a very good job, but you don't have equity or you don't have wealthy parents, or and so there is that other layer. What Will is saying is still true for Victoria, I think, but just with that caveat. That's a tricky one, you know. It's a political question, and yeah, I know, and as one of many options that should be available, and they're not the right answer for everyone. But to go back to, I guess I didn't quite get there with what I was saying last. We design our economies too, right? That's the result of human decisions. It might not be my decision, it might not be your decision, but some human, or actually some group of humans, have made that decision. And we can't just throw our hands up and say, it's just the way things are. I think that it's the political question of where do you put pressure to change? And so for tiny homes, it's putting pressure on city councillors and city staff who make the bylaws. When you're talking about what's making housing in Vancouver so terribly unaffordable, it's on a provincial and federal level, the regulations where people with money are influencing how those regulations evolve more than people without money. But people without money still have votes, right? And people without money still have voices, and they can make a stink and make arguments and get people on their side. And I think that's really what needs to happen. And yeah, we always need to remember that all of these things are people making decisions. You just need to find out who's making the decisions and whether you agree with them or not, and try to influence or replace them.
I think there's a good example of a trial and an error. I think it eventually failed, but the demolition of houses in Shaughnessy in Vancouver, very similar to what's happening in the uplands over in Oak Bay and many other communities around Victoria too, where a very nice house by almost everyone's standards is being demolished and replaced with a larger house, which may or may not be a nice house after closer inspection, but that's not the point. And so there's been some effort to try and limit the amount of demolition and restructuring of these areas. I believe that was struck down, and maybe someone here could correct me on this, because it infringed on the rights of people who want to do that. So as a landowner, you have the right to do what you will with your land. Now, I think what you're touching on here is that we can design the city and the regulations to make better decisions easier and the wrong decisions harder or even impossible. Now, that does take a stick and hopefully a carrot too. You can't go all stick. That won't fly in our society. People need to see a benefit to doing the right thing, as well as the prevention from doing the wrong thing here. But I think you're right about talking about our societies and how we can look at ways to reorganize the way that planning is done in our city, the way that development as a whole will happen in our cities. And I think that's the key here, is that we have to take a very big-eyed look at what our cities are doing and the effects of all these little decisions on the big picture. And once we can see the big picture and see how all these things affect it, we can see that that one little rule in the design guidelines or the OCP for Victoria has a massive effect, and what that will do to our economy and to our environment over the next 100 years. And I think it's that big perspective that we need to have. And you're quite right that I think as a community, it's our role to stand up and do something about that. I think something that I'm not sure if you've read Naomi Klein's books. She talks about implementing something called polluter pays, and this being a fundamental kind of law of all of production for all things, which means that if I'm the chairman of Toshiba, I have to deal with every television after it's been used. And so when it goes to the landfill, it's my responsibility. Now, I can estimate that if I were the chairman of Toshiba and recognized that all of my TVs were going to become a personal liability once they hit the landfill, I'd probably redesign them. I would design them so that when I took them back, because I have to, or when I reclaim them, I can find value out of that. And that's not to say that you have to cancel the economy or you have to, kill the jobs or you have to do any of those things. It's about redesigning it. And the idea of polluter pays would mean that everybody who creates something that is destined for the landfill would have to redesign that item. And the design of that item would then dictate its whole value. The redesign of that item would change the whole way that it deals with our economy, the way it deals with transportation infrastructure. The new economies would emerge that deal with not just recycling, but repurposing and redesigning items after the fact.